The Harrison family was well known in Atlanta's wealthy circles. David Harrison, a top corporate lawyer, had built a reputation as a man of success and charm. He was often the center of attention at social events, praised for his accomplishments and generosity. Grace Harrison, his wife, was admired for her elegance and devotion to their family. Together, they seemed like the ideal couple, raising their two teenage children, Emily and Alex, in a life of privilege. Their mansion, sitting on the edge of the city, reflected their status. It was grand, perfectly maintained, and filled with reminders of David's success awards, photographs, and carefully chosen decorations. But for Grace, that house wasn't a home. It was a place where appearances mattered more than anything, and keeping up those appearances came at a personal cost. From the outside, they were the definition of a picture-perfect family. But inside, cracks were forming, cracks that no one saw, not even their closest friends or family. What seemed like a story of achievement and love was built on something much darker. This reunion would not only reveal those cracks, but break them wide open. David Harrison was a man who wore two faces. To the world, he was the successful lawyer with a magnetic personality, always ready with a story or a smile. He thrived in the spotlight, attending charity events and delivering speeches that impressed everyone around him. But behind closed doors, he was someone completely different, a man whose temper and control ruled his household. Grace, his wife, had spent years hiding the truth. To support David's career, she had given up her own dreams and focused on their family, hoping her sacrifices would be enough to keep the peace. But nothing ever was. David's moods were unpredictable, and the fear of his anger became a constant shadow in their home. His words cut deep, his actions left scars, and his power over the family was absolute. To the children, Emily and Alex, their father's charm and success made him larger than life. They saw the public version of him, the one who brought them gifts and celebrated their milestones. But Grace saw everything else. She knew the cost of living in his world. And though she had spent years trying to shield her kids from the truth, the day was coming when the facade would crumble. June 12, 2010, started like any other important day at the Harrison estate. Grace was up early, carefully going over every detail for the family reunion. The catering team was busy in the kitchen, the garden was perfectly decorated, and the house sparkled as if it were ready for a magazine shoot. Grace moved quickly through the houses, giving instructions and fixing last-minute details, all while keeping up the smile everyone expected from her. The pressure to make everything perfect wasn't just about impressing the guests. For Grace, it was about keeping control of a life that often felt out of her hands. Every perfect flower arrangement, every carefully placed chair was part of the image she had built to hide the cracks in her marriage. But that morning, something was different. Beneath her usual calm, there was a heaviness she couldn't shake. As the clock inched closer to noon, guests began to arrive. Family members, friends, and business associates filled the house, bringing with them laughter and chatter. Grace welcomed them all, her practiced smile never faltering, but her hands trembled slightly when no one was looking. It wasn't just the stress of hosting, something deeper was stirring inside her. She didn't know it yet, but this was the day her life would begin to change forever. As the reunion went on, the laughter and conversations filled the air, but Grace's mind was elsewhere. She moved through the crowd, greeting guests and answering questions about the house and the food, all while keeping an eye on David. He was in his element, charming everyone with his stories and jokes, playing the perfect host. To the outside world, he seemed untouchable, a man admired by all. Grace, however, knew the man behind the performance. Every laugh and every compliment only reminded her of the stark contrast between the David the world saw and the David she knew at home. She noticed how easily he commanded attention, how effortlessly he made people feel at ease. It was this same ability to control a room that he used to control her life. And yet, surrounded by people who adored him, she felt utterly alone. As she watched him from across the room, Grace began to notice the small signs she had overlooked before. The long glances he exchanged with Samantha Boyd, the junior associate from his firm who had arrived late to the reunion. The way Samantha avoided Grace's gaze while looking too comfortable in David's presence. A knot formed in Grace's stomach as her instincts told her something wasn't right. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just her nerves, but deep down, she knew better. It was mid-afternoon when Grace's unease turned into certainty. She noticed David slipping away from the gathering, his demeanor unusually casual for someone hosting a party. Curious and unable to ignore her instincts, Grace quietly followed him at a distance. She watched as he walked toward the guest house on the edge of their property, a space reserved for visitors but rarely used during events like this. Moments later, Samantha Boyd appeared. Grace froze as she saw the young woman glance around nervously before entering the guest house with David. The sight hit her like a punch to the stomach. For months, Grace had felt something was off. David's late nights at work, the unexplained expenses, the growing distance between them. But now there was no denying it. The pieces were falling into place. She couldn't hear what was being said, but their body language spoke volumes. David appeared calm and confident, while Samantha seemed tense, almost pleading. Grace's heart raced as she realized the truth. This wasn't just a passing suspicion. It was proof of a betrayal she could no longer ignore. Shaken and struggling to maintain her composure, she returned to the party, unsure of what to do next, but knowing her life would never be the same. Grace returned to the party, her thoughts spinning and her emotions barely contained. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, smiling and nodding when necessary, but hearing none of the conversations around her. Her mind kept replaying what she had seen. The sight of David with Samantha was now burned into her memory, and every moment at the reunion felt heavier with the weight of her discovery. David rejoined the gathering not long after, his demeanor as smooth and confident as ever. He mingled with guests, shared stories, and even made a toast, raising his glass to family and the bonds that hold them together. The crowd clapped and cheered, but Grace felt her stomach churn. His words, so polished and full of meaning to everyone else, felt hollow and mocking to her. As the afternoon wore on, Grace noticed small details that now seemed impossible to ignore. David lingered near Samantha more than necessary, his hand brushing hers in ways that seemed far too familiar. Samantha, for her part, looked uneasy, her smile forced, and her laughter nervous. It was clear to Grace that Samantha knew the risks but had chosen to play along, likely drawn in by David's charm and power. For Grace, these moments only deepened her resolve to act, though she wasn't sure how or when. All she knew was that this lie couldn't continue. As the evening approached, the atmosphere at the party shifted. Guests were beginning to relax, enjoying drinks and casual conversations, but Grace felt as if she was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Every glance at David filled her with anger, and every laugh from the crowd reminded her of the lie she was living. Her thoughts were racing, and she struggled to keep her emotions from spilling over. David's behavior grew bolder as the hours went by. He stood closer to Samantha, his tone with her softer and more familiar than it should have been. It was no longer subtle. The signs of their relationship were right in front of Grace, and she wondered how no one else seemed to notice. Or perhaps they did, and no one dared to say a word. Grace's mother approached her again, sensing something wasn't right. This time, her concern was stronger, her words firmer as she asked Grace what was wrong. But Grace couldn't bring herself to share the truth, not here, not now. She brushed off the concern with a shaky smile, but inside, she felt the storm building. Every small act of David's arrogance, every knowing glance he shared with Samantha, pushed her closer to a breaking point she could no longer ignore. By late afternoon, Grace's composure was barely holding. The once joyful gathering had become unbearable, with every passing moment adding to her growing anger and sense of betrayal. David, oblivious to her turmoil, continued to bask in the admiration of their guests. His confidence seemed unshaken, his charm as effortless as ever. But for Grace, the mask he wore was now impossible to tolerate. As she stood among the guests, offering drinks and making polite conversation, her mind was racing. How long had this been going on? How many lies had she believed over the years? And how could she protect her children from the fallout of what she now knew? She couldn't stop replaying the image of David with Samantha and the ease with which they carried on their charade. Emily, her teenage daughter, had noticed Grace's distracted demeanor and asked if everything was okay. Grace reassured her with a quick smile, unwilling to burden her children with the truth. But the worry in Emily's eyes lingered. Grace knew she couldn't let this continue, not for herself and not for her kids. She felt trapped, torn between the fear of what might happen if she acted and the certainty that doing nothing would only make things worse. The choice was becoming clear. She could no longer stay silent. As the sun began to set, the party's cheerful energy masked the growing storm within Grace. While guests mingled and enjoyed the evening, she could feel the tension building inside her like a tightly coiled spring. She tried to focus on her children, Emily and Alex, who were chatting with relatives and enjoying the day as if everything was normal. For their sake, she fought to keep herself together, but her resolve was wearing thin. David's behavior became even more audacious. He lingered around Samantha with a casual arrogance that infuriated Grace. Every small interaction between them felt like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of how little he cared about hiding his betrayal. Samantha, meanwhile, seemed increasingly uneasy, avoiding Grace's gaze and fidgeting nervously whenever they crossed paths. It was clear she wanted to maintain the illusion of professionalism, but the cracks in her facade were becoming harder to hide. Grace's instincts told her it was time to act, but she wasn't sure how. She knew David's power and influence could crush her if she moved recklessly, but the thought of enduring one more day in silence felt unbearable. As the guests raised their glasses in another toast, Grace stood quietly in the background, clutching the edge of a tablecloth, her knuckles white. In that moment, she realized she was done pretending. She didn't know exactly how, but she vowed to end this nightmare not tomorrow, not next week, but now. As the evening stretched on, Grace's emotions shifted from despair to determination. She no longer felt paralyzed by fear, but driven by the need to take control of her life. For years, she had been the silent supporter, the one who sacrificed and endured. But now, she felt a spark of defiance growing inside her. David's carelessness, his blatant disregard for her feelings, had pushed her past the point of no return. While David continued his performance as the charming host, Grace quietly began to gather herself. She mentally rehearsed what she would say and how she would confront him. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about everything. The years of control, the emotional abuse, and the power he had wielded over her. For too long, she had convinced herself she had no way out. Now, she saw things differently. Staying silent meant losing herself completely, and that was no longer an option. The guests, still unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, started to wind down their conversations. Some began saying their goodbyes, while others lingered, chatting casually. Grace moved through the room, her expression calm but her mind sharp. She had no intention of causing a scene here and now. Instead, she was preparing for something bigger, something final. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt ready. As the final guests began to leave, the once lively atmosphere of the party gave way to an uneasy quiet. The garden lights flickered softly, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Grace stood near the edge of the veranda, watching the last of the cars pull away. She felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, but also a steely resolve. The moment she had dreaded for years had arrived. She could no longer avoid confronting the truth of her life. David, clearly in high spirits, walked back into the house without a second glance at Grace. For him, the day had been a success. He had impressed his guests, maintained his image, and carried on his affair without a single challenge. But for Grace, this was the end of the charade. The weight of everything she had endured pressed on her like never before. But this time, she felt ready to push back. The house, now quiet, felt suffocating. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture, seemed like a reminder of the control David had over her life. But Grace wasn't thinking about fear anymore. She was thinking about freedom, not just for herself, but for Emily and Alex, who deserved a life free from secrets and lies. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Tonight, she decided, would be the turning point. What came next wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to take the first step toward reclaiming her life. The night settled over the Harrison estate, and the house was eerily quiet. Grace sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. The day's events replayed in her mind, each moment sharpening her resolve. She had spent years convincing herself she had no choice, that her silence was the only way to keep the family intact. But now she saw the truth. Her silence had only given David more power. Her children's faces came to mind: Emily, with her quiet concern earlier in the day, and Alex, oblivious to the tension but trusting his parents to protect him. Grace realized that staying silent wasn't protecting them, it was exposing them to the very life she wanted to shield them from. They deserved more than this. They deserved a mother who would fight for them and for herself. With trembling hands, Grace began gathering what she needed. Over the years, she had quietly documented David's abuse photos, medical records, and notes hidden away in case she ever found the courage to act. She opened the folder where it all was stored, staring at the evidence she had collected. It felt surreal to see her pain laid out so clearly, but it also gave her strength. This was her story, and she was finally ready to tell it. Tonight was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would no longer live in fear. Grace's determination carried her through the night. While the rest of the house slept, she stayed awake, piecing together her plan. Every photo she had taken, every note she had written about David's outbursts, and every receipt she had saved were now spread out before her. It was a timeline of her suffering, but also a map of her escape. Each piece of evidence felt like a small victory, proof that she hadn't been imagining the years of pain she had endured. Her thoughts drifted to Emily and Alex again. They had witnessed more than she ever wanted them to. The fear in their eyes during David's outbursts and the way they tiptoed around the house to avoid upsetting him haunted her. Grace knew that if she didn't act now, they would carry those memories into adulthood, believing that this was what family looked like. She couldn't let that happen. The first step, she decided, was to get legal help. Grace made a list of resources she had heard about: women's shelters, support groups, and lawyers who specialized in family law. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt a sense of control. This wasn't just about exposing David or ending the marriage. It was about reclaiming her life and showing her children that strength doesn't come from silence, it comes from action. As the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, Grace took a deep breath. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she was ready to face it. As the morning sun poured into the Harrison estate, Grace took her first tangible steps toward freedom. She quietly left the house before anyone else was awake, clutching the folder that held her evidence. The drive to the local police station felt surreal. Every mile she covered was a step away from fear and a step closer to reclaiming her life. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, but her mind was steady. She was done waiting for a better time. This was the moment. When she arrived, she was greeted by an officer who listened patiently as she explained her situation. With each word, Grace felt the weight of years of silence start to lift. She handed over photographs, medical records, and a detailed written account of the abuse she had endured. The officer's expression grew more serious with every piece of evidence she presented, and for the first time in years, Grace felt like someone believed her. By the time she left the station, the initial steps had been taken. A protective order was in motion, and there was talk of launching an investigation into David's actions. Grace sat in her car for a moment, her emotions swirling. Relief, fear, and a strange new feeling: hope. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting back. It wasn't over yet, but Grace knew she had made a choice that would change everything, not just for herself, but for her children as well. Later that same day, the carefully constructed image of David Harrison began to crumble. News of the protective order and pending investigation reached his office, where he had built his reputation as a respected lawyer. Grace had known that exposing him would send shockwaves through their social circle and professional connections, but she also knew it was necessary. For too long, David's charm had shielded him from accountability. By the afternoon, law enforcement arrived at his office to serve him with a protective order. The sight of David Harrison, a man once admired by his colleagues, being confronted by officers was met with shock and hushed whispers. His attempts to downplay the situation were met with skepticism. It was clear to those around him that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a personal dispute blown out of proportion. Grace's evidence spoke louder than David's carefully crafted denials. At home, Grace prepared for the inevitable backlash. She knew David wouldn't go quietly, and his influence still loomed large. But she also felt a newfound strength. She had taken the first step, and now there was no going back. Her focus shifted to her children, ensuring they felt safe and supported during the upheaval. For Grace, the fight wasn't just about justice, it was about building a life free from fear, one where she and her children could finally breathe. The foundation of David's power was cracking, and Grace was ready to face whatever came next. As word of David's arrest spread, the reaction was swift and unforgiving. Friends, colleagues, and even family members who had once admired him began to distance themselves. The news was unavoidable. Headlines detailed his arrest, the allegations of abuse, and Grace's brave decision to come forward. For a man who had built his entire identity on status and respect, the public exposure was a devastating blow.